Well, Maddox, if we start with you, we've seen inaction by the government for 3 years. Are we out of that period now, do you think? I mean, the consolidation of number 10 and number 11, what difference does that make?
Makes quite a lot. I mean, we have a new government, and one of the biggest differences is that this one has an effective majority of 87. So it really is free to go ahead with what it wants. And what it wants is very ambitious. It has set out all these plans for a lot of spending, a lot of development of many parts of the country. The question is whether it can really bring that about and whether it's really prepared to do it. We've just heard from Andy Street. Is it really going to be prepared to give power away to local authorities, let them keep more of the money that they raise? It's amazing how governments talk a lot about this before they're elected, and when it actually comes to it, do they really do it? But I think a lot has changed with the majority, with the clear out and shake up of the cabinet. Boris Johnson now has a very unified cabinet. We heard them, almost chanting in chorus earlier. Slightly humiliating, I thought. But he clearly has a team now who's going to do exactly what he wants. And on the face of it, that's quite a lot.
And Stephen Bush, you've, I think, said this is the most significant development since devolution. Isn't it really just getting rid of a few advisors and trying to have a bit of coordination?
Well, yeah, but a bit of coordination is quite a big difference, right? I mean, if we imagine, for example, that I earned 10% more next year than this year, well, 10% is not a very big number, but actually it's quite a big deal to most people. And even though we're really talking about a change which may unlock that level of extra sort of policy cohesion and unity between the top team, that's quite a big difference. I mean, to give you a historical example, this is a setup which potentially, if Tony Blair had it in 1998, we would be members of the euro now. And if Harold Wilson had it in 1968, he wouldn't have devalued sterling. So we are talking about, yes, very, very small individual decisions, but with huge potential impacts on how we're governed, who decides it. I mean, in many ways, the fascinating thing here is this is a structure of government that many politicians have flirted with, but they've usually flirted with it in opposition, and by the time they've got into office, they haven't been quite powerful enough to pull it off. So although this isn't particularly new in terms of the ideas, it has real potential to be a big, big change for how we're governed.
Bronwen, you just said sort of slightly humiliating in terms of the pantomime call and response. Would you rate this as appearing to be a much more pliable, pliant government, or is actually it impossible for number 10 to have, government is so big, it's impossible for number 10 to kind of have all the control?
Well, I think it will find that, and I think it will find it's very hard to deliver some of those ideas. Every government finds that, though unity in the cabinet does take you quite a long way. What I think is one of the questions that this reshuffle has raised is whether this new government is so sort of exhilarated by its majority that it really is impatient of any constraint on what it wants to do, from the Treasury, traditional source of constraint on prime ministers, from the judiciary possibly. We've got the buildings of a swipe at the judiciary there, and whether it's careless with relationships. Jettisoning the Northern Ireland secretary, I think, is really quite dangerous just after he had managed to get the Assembly in Northern Ireland to reform after 3 years. And that just shows, to me, it suggests possibly that this government is more casual about relationships that it may need than is really going to serve it well. And of course, that's before even considering the Brexit talks, where it's got to decide, is it really going to work through these very patient questions of diplomacy or just walk out?
And Stephen, have the Red Wall Conservatives won? Did their demands trump the sort of traditional, more fiscally conservative side of that party?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, yes, there are lots of Conservatives who've been elected for constituencies that the Conservative Party has never won, but there's no really such thing as a Red Wall Conservative MP. Many of them are old school Thatcherites or Dries or whatever analogy you want. And we don't...
But they do want investment in their area, and that's what they're asking for.
Every MP wants investment in their own area, but in practice, they also want taxes to remain low. And I think the important thing to remember is this was not Sajid Javid leaving because of a row over fiscal policy. This was Sajid Javid leaving over a role about machinery of government. And, Rishi Sunak is an Osborne protege. I don't think he's sitting there going, do you know what doesn't really matter? Government debt. Do you know what's a good idea? Let's have unrestrained deficit spending at the top of the economic cycle. So the kind of big question that we had about this government right at the beginning is, how can you reconcile its ambition on spending with its promise to be very parsimonious on tax rises? And that problem hasn't gone away. Yes, if Sajid Javid's debt pledge goes with him, which is not certain, that increases the amount of revenue a little bit, but we are still talking about a very tight fiscal round unless Rishi Sunak is willing to contemplate breaking promises on tax or contemplating things like a mansion tax, vehicle exercise duty. These are big questions for any Conservative.
Very quickly, we haven't got much time, but do you think that is feasible?
I'm sceptical that they're going to be quite as tight as you're suggesting. George Osborne is now quite some time ago, and he changed at the end. No, I think the mood is towards more spending, and I'd be surprised if we didn't see a looser policy than under the previous Chancellor.
Maddox, Stephen Bush, we will keep watching. You'll be back, I'm sure.